Good morning once again.
Good morning.
I am delighted and honored to preach and worship with you at Fountain Street Church today. This extraordinary congregation has such an amazing history and has enriched our community in so many ways. And Fountain Street has enriched my life in a very significant and personal way through one of your former members, the late Alice Roby, who was my 6th grade teacher at Sherwood Park School. Now, I don't recall that she ever spoke of religion to me directly, but somehow I knew that she was an active member of this congregation and sang in your choir, and that Fountain Street Church was an important part of who she was and the service she rendered in her life. I'm ever grateful for her joyful, wacky, welcoming, and loving presence, how she would always just break out in song for no reason at all. She loved and challenged her students fiercely. What more could anyone ask of a teacher? So, Mrs. Roby, I trust that you are in some way here with us today. And I hope that if I use some of the 25-cent words that you taught me, that I put them in the appropriate context, spelled and pronounced correctly, of course. I was invited to preach by Matthew, yet another Fountain Street member who has enriched my life. And as Matthew mentioned, we met in the fall of 2007 when we were both participants in the Spiritual Formation Foundations course offered by Dominican Center at Marywood, where I now work. This course gave us a structured opportunity to deepen our awareness of and relationship with God, to integrate our personal spirituality more fully with the Christian church, other religions, and the world, and also to gain a deeper understanding of the academic development of Christian spirituality and mysticism. So you might think that after spending 9 months studying all of that we would be well equipped to explain the mysteries of spirituality to you. Well, maybe Matthew is, but I'm not in the least. See, I should have been suspicious when I got the reading list for this course, and one of the main texts was a book called The Cloud of Unknowing. Now, wouldn't a title like that raise red flags for you right away? And if the title isn't bad enough, get this. It was written in the 14th century by an anonymous author who based his or her work on another anonymous author from the 6th century. So it has a confusing title. We don't know who wrote it or on whose scholarly work it was based. Nonetheless, The Cloud of Unknowing is one of the great classics of Christian spirituality. Saying that you've studied spirituality without reading this book is like saying you know all about baseball, except you never heard of someone named Babe Ruth or Joe DiMaggio. So I want to give you just a couple of my favorite quotes from the book. Nature designed the senses to acquire knowledge of the material world, not to understand the inner realities of the spirit. What I'm trying to say is, humanity knows the things of the spirit more by what they are not than by what they are. That clear it up for you? Here's another one. God is unlike anything we know. We must keep in mind that the ideas we have of God are totally inadequate to contain God. So our unknown author is basically telling us that the most we can ever hope to know about God is that we can never really know about God. So you ask the question maybe, why is this book a classic? Why do all of the other spiritual giants echo its themes? Why did Matthew and I spend 9 months studying all of this stuff? I guess the only answer could be maybe because it's true. But there is another aspect to this unknown author's thesis. So listen to this. God can be loved, but cannot be thought. God can be grasped by love, but never by concepts. So less thinking and more loving. I like that one. Less thinking, more loving. It's so simple that it seems almost silly. We can use our brains to know about God, but the only way to know God is with our hearts. The only way to know God is through love. Our love for God, God's love for us, and our love for each other. Now, I know I just said that the idea of knowing God through love is so simple that it seems almost silly, but there is something tricky about it. And I say this because looking at the track record of human history and personal experience, we don't actually do this very well or very often, it seems. History sadly reveals that we've spent an enormous amount of time trying to be intellectually and legally right about God. We've tried to capture God intellectually with debates, creeds, doctrines, rules, and regulations. Now, to be fair, it's much harder to quantify or measure the amount of energy that we've invested in building loving relationships with God and others. How do you measure that? Still, I think it's probably safe to say that considering the state of the world today, we haven't focused on this part enough. Do you agree? Yeah. But most of us, if we were being really honest, would admit that there is something comforting about having a rule book, or at least an expert's advice. And in part, this is why human beings form societies and religions. We want to band together under the protection of all who are right. But then before we know it, we've confused belonging with excluding. And this perhaps is why we need mystics. Perhaps why every religion has them. Mystics remind us that we all belong, that everything belongs. Mystics remind us that God does not belong to us, rather we belong to God. So let's explore this concept a little bit further by returning to the scripture passage that I read this morning and that midrash. But first, the scripture. Now, if you think about it, at first glance, this passage could be used to promote and support a need for religious leaders to go off somewhere and confer with God and to bring back an exact message for the rest of us. Something so exact it's, you might even say, carved in stone. These leaders have typically been male. And when they go off somewhere, it's usually upwards, right? Now, I'm not saying this is entirely a bad idea or a practice. When folks band together, they do need leaders. And since half of the human race is made up of men, well, it makes sense that at least some of these leaders are male. But the problem comes, of course, when we stop at only this first glance at readings like this. Stopping with only a glance can lead to distortions of religious practice that render leaders, especially male leaders, as all-powerful, and those led as powerless. And of course, there is that other half of the human race to consider. If all we see are male leaders, it can easily lead us to think that men are the only ones worth following. Now, I doubt that anyone here this morning would dispute the need to take more than a first glance at a scripture passage or to look to women for leadership. If that was all you wanted, you would probably be worshiping somewhere else this morning, or maybe not at all.